Well, I suppose it's time for another installment in our periodic tour of the inexorable decline and fall of woke Hollywood, and we've got a couple of interesting entries today, and by interesting I mean insufferable, nauseating trash that I would only ever watch for purposes of mocking it. She-Hulk came out on woke Disney Plus over the weekend, but I think we'll save that one for the main segment, as there is much to unpack. More than you might expect, in fact. And over on HBO Max, we've got the long-awaited Game of Thrones prequel. What's that, Jim Eagle? You say it isn't long-awaited? Nobody actually gives a damn? Well, thank you very much for the correction, then. Also, you're fired. Get the fuck out. House of the Dragon is the name of this new show, and the first episode just dropped last night. I haven't actually read or watched any of the reviews on it, but from the tenor of the titles and the headlines I've seen, there seems to be cautious optimism about what people saw in the first hour, as if the producers have succeeded in ticking all the requisite boxes that needed to be ticked. Well, we've got titties and blood and some dudes getting their heads split open, so woohoo! Welcome back, Game of Thrones. But, of course, if we take the cold, cynical view, and that's what we're here for after all, an observer could just as well say, this is the most mawkish attempt at fan service pornography that I've seen since Rogue One came out. Look, it's location you recognize. Look, it's surname you've heard before. Look, it's character who vaguely reminds you of their counterpart character from the other show. But here's the thing about Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is not Star Wars. There is not some huge, latent Game of Thrones fandom made up of people who will happily consume any franchise-branded product you try and shove down their gullet. There might have been that if the other show had stuck the landing in Season 7 and Season 8, if they had managed to craft a conclusion to the story that was on par quality-wise with the first 6 seasons, but then, that's the trouble with making book adaptations, isn't it? They go really well right up until you run out of book and have to fill in the rest of the story by your damn self. If they had managed to get the ball over the goal line, if they had come up with a Season 7 and Season 8 that were as good as the first 6, then yeah, there might have been a possibility that this franchise universe might have been able to stand on the same ground that Marvel and Star Wars stand on, but that did not happen. In fact, the end of Game of Thrones left such a bad taste in everybody's mouth that some of its biggest fans and supporters wound up turning into its most vociferous critics. And for the people who are also fans of the source material, there is the added frustration of the fact that George Martin has failed for nearly a dozen years now at turning in a completed manuscript for The Winds of Winter. And there's little reason to believe he will ever get around to finishing the thing. The point being, HBO is budgeting something like $20 million per episode for this new show, and they're releasing it into a world where the people who are most likely to be interested in it are also the people most likely to be predisposed toward hating it. But is it woke? Yes, dear viewer, it is woke. And no amount of tits and decapitations can change that fact when your whole narrative appears to rest on the notion that girls are awesome, girls are way better at all things than boys are, and things would improve around here if we smashed the patriarchy and established a permanent, beautiful vaginocracy in its place. Oh, and they've got black Valerians. That is also a thing. You heard me correctly. I said black Valerians, which, if you're not familiar with the lore of this particular universe, that's rather like doing a remake of Lord of the Rings in which Elrond the Elf King is played by Yaphet Kotto. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where I'm taking casting suggestions for who should play the title role in the epic biopic The Life of Curmudgeon. And the first person who says Kid Rock is fucking banned, by the way. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Westeros and all ships in the narrow sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. Now, we know that Marvel is woke as fuck. We know they consciously embarked on a mission of corporate suicide starting 3 years ago, when they had just wrapped up the Infinity Saga, and under Kevin Feige's leadership, they stood as the most profitable and powerful studio in the history of motion pictures. And they enjoyed almost a limitless reserve of fan goodwill. It's weird how long ago 900 something odd days can seem. Is it not? Because that's how long it is. Not even 1,000 days between the triumph of Avengers Endgame and the shit show of She-Hulk. But here's the thing about She-Hulk. The character, I mean. Not the new crappy show. I remember when She-Hulk came out. I was 11 years old and probably more heavily into comic books than I ever would be before or since. So there's a crucial thing I remember about that character that the creators of this new show very clearly do not. She-Hulk was a parody. And not just of one thing either. On the most superficial level, she was a parody of second wave feminism. Of the stereotypical independent-minded 80s woman who didn't need no man, who's got all the fulfillment she ever needs from her giant shoulder pads and her can of Aquanet Extra Super Hold and her professional career shuffling papers down at the widget factory. So it really is all kinds of awkward watching this show and realizing the people who are making it, and they all seem to be in the same demographic as the title character. Late 30s, unmarried, borderline alcoholic, 17 cats, you know the routine. They don't have any idea the character they are adapting was created to make fun of people like themselves. So they think they're mocking male chauvinism and the patriarchy and whatever, but really they're just saying, quite unwittingly, yeah, we totally are not in on the joke here. So trying to make She-Hulk into a non-ironic vehicle for third-wave 21st century feminism, that is... I'm not even sure what that's like. Normally I'm always able to summon a fitting metaphor, but I must not be myself this evening, for I seem to be drawing a blank. Actually, no. Here it is. I've got it. It's like an adaptation of Wayne's World in which the guy making the film thinks the characters are serious music journalists. Now, if I told you that Marvel had made a story about a bitter, angry feminist who enjoys physically assaulting men who have said nothing remotely improper to her, your first instinct might be to say, yeah, that was Captain Marvel. I saw that movie. It came out in 2019. And you'd be correct, of course, but here's the difference. The Carol Danvers version of Captain America, the sullen, surly man-hater, the one that Brie Larson plays so convincingly in the movies, she's only existed in the comics for less than a decade, if I'm not mistaken, and nobody can stand her. They've had to reboot that book 4 or 5 times or something like that. But She-Hulk came out in the early 80s, and her book, it was often really good and funny, which is why the character is remembered fondly by so many people in my age group when you wouldn't necessarily think that would be the case. Because she wasn't just a parody of the 80s feminist archetype, she was also a parody of female comic book characters more broadly. So when they showed her being able to easily outclass her male counterparts in feats of physical prowess, it wasn't meant as something to be taken at face value. It was done with a wink and a nod, as if to say, look, we have flipped the script. We're subverting expectations, if you will. But how could we ever expect a group of 30-something women in the third decade of the 21st century, women who have spent their lives being steeped in the broth of irrational gender grievance, who've made their careers in a Hollywood where you're not supposed to laugh when an 87-pound female easily dispatches a 250-pound man in hand-to-hand single combat? How do you look at a group of people like that and expect them to grasp the nuance and the subtlety of a character that was created 40 years ago as a gentle mockery of radical feminist dogma run amok? The answer is, you can't. So even though they're calling this thing a comedy, they are playing it straight in all the wrong ways, getting the source material completely wrong, and you're left with a product that's 8 or 10 episodes of dog shit in a 6-episode bag. And ladies and gentlemen, when I say this feels like an angry, radical feminist box-checking exercise, I am really not overstating that matter at all. Remember the scene in Captain Marvel where the motorcycle guy says she's pretty and asks her to smile, and her response is to beat the shit out of him and steal his clothes and his vehicle? There are a couple of beats in She-Hulk that make that look positively subtle by comparison, frankly. The first is when she is casually hanging out with the other Hulk, Man-Hulk, if you will, whose sole function in this story is to be worse at everything than the female Hulk. And he remarks that she's going to have to learn to keep a handle on her anger and her rage and her negative emotions. And her response to that is, I do that every time I get catcalled in the street. I do that every time some incompetent man explains my own area of expertise to me. And then she says some crazy shit about how she's liable to get murdered just because she's a chick. I wasn't sure what that part was all about. But first we need to talk about that word, catcall. 5 years ago, I don't think I had ever heard a real person say that word out loud. I think I had only ever seen it in books, but never spoken, and certainly not spoken with regularity. The first person I remember saying that word out loud is the young gentle lady from the New York 14th District, and I've heard her use it numerous times since, pretty much every time she complains about garnering unwanted male attention, which is just about every time she opens her gigantic horse-sized mouth. And look, let's just go ahead and ask the awkward question we're not supposed to ask. These complaints about catcalling, are they actual complaints? Or are they acts of psychological wish fulfillment by angry, dumpy women who wish they were prettier than they are? The actress who plays She-Hulk, I don't know what her age is, but I'm confident she's between 35 and 40, and she probably looks closer to the latter than the former. She is also, not to be mean, but she's not all that great looking. But there's a scene in this episode where she's standing outside a bar, alone, dirty, disheveled, and a few young men show up. Men who are at least 10 years her junior. They start chatting her up. They ask her if she wants to come hang out. Now, before we talk about what happens next, let's talk about what happens if this is the real world. In the real world, if a girl of that age and appearance got hit on outside a bar by 3 handsome younger men, she would be bragging about that to her girlfriends for the rest of her natural-born life. But we are not in the real world, are we? Nope, we are in angry, sexless cat lady land. So when strange men approach your self-proxy titled character and start talking about saying nice things about her appearance, well, that only can mean one thing. It is time to transform into a green rage monster and beat those assholes within an inch of their lives. That'll teach them to say polite things to ladies. Now, I brought up the gentle lady from the New York 14th District because we know all too well her predilection for assuming all men everywhere want nothing else but to get inside her knickers, and when she says the things she says, she goes so over the top with it that there often is little other choice but to view it at what it almost certainly is, some weird confluence of narcissism, insecurity, and erotic wish fulfillment. She sees a world full of men who desire her sexually because that is the sort of world that she wishes to see. That's the sort of world in which she would most like to live, and I feel like She-Hulk, in her role as the wish fulfillment proxy for her cadre of congenitally unhappy female creators, views her world in much the same way as Sandy Cortez. She desperately wants romantic attention from the opposite sex, but when she gets it, she reacts with anger and violence. And when she doesn't get it, she has to invent it in her own mind. And I think we're on a bit of a roll here with asking the uncomfortable question, so let's ask another one. Why is it that militant feminists are the ones who seem most predisposed to measuring their self-worth according to other people's perceptions of their physical desirability? I don't have an answer for that one. It's just been bugging me for a lot of years, is all. And here's another one. Back to the catcalling file. My living memory goes back to around 1980 or so, and I never remember living in a world where it was considered culturally normative or socially acceptable for men to shout sexually boorish remarks at passing women. And no, a whistle is not a sexually boorish remark, but I'm supposed to believe Sandy Cortez from Long Island, born in 1989, has spent her young life having her innocence verbally assaulted by every dock worker and construction laborer she has ever walked past. Oh, the catcalling! I can't take this relentless catcalling, and I would so much love to know how they settled on that particular word. It makes it impossible for me to take the complaint seriously when such an unserious word is being used to describe the supposed conduct. But it's got to be said. The show tells us right at the top what we are in for. When we see arranged on the bookcase in the title character's office a Ruth Bader Ginsburg bobblehead, a Michelle Obama bobblehead, and some other ridiculous thing that made me facepalm, but I can't remember it at the moment. I guess it's something that can just be taken for granted, that if you are a successful professional woman, then obviously you idolize female Democrats. How could you not? Because if you didn't idolize female Democrats, if you didn't have that RBG bobblehead and that Hillary Clinton license plate frame, well, you wouldn't be a successful professional woman at all. You'd be barefoot in some kitchen somewhere, handcuffed to a stove, fixing to pop out baby number 7, hoping against hope that your husband Jethro manages to kill enough varmints to make a proper stew for supper. And there but for the grace of God go we all, ladies, I suppose, right? Because of the vision and the sacrifices of women like those bobbleheads, you don't have to be consigned against your will to a hellish future of children and family and noble sacrifice and unconditional love. You can have a life of true happiness and fulfillment because those papers at the widget factory, they are not going to shuffle themselves. That box of Chardonnay isn't going to drink itself after work. Those 17 cats aren't going to feed themselves. And hey, maybe this weekend you can go down to the bar and find some random stranger with whom to engage in perfunctory fleshy congress for a few hours. And sure, maybe this all just sounds like a lazy anti-feminism harangue. But before you go jump into any such conclusions, I would advise the jumper to check the statistics for him or herself. The central premise of feminism all along has been the idea that if you unshackle women from the duties of motherhood and homemaking and so on, if you enable them to have all the sex they want with none of the consequences, if you give them all the same job opportunities as their male counterparts, then women will live, on the whole, lives that are happier and more fulfilling. Except American women are more unhappy today than they ever have been since they began collecting the data. And it isn't particularly close. It's a consistent downward spiral that begins right at the exact moment second wave feminism drops at the beginning of the 1970s, half a century ago. So feminism did not deliver on its central promise. It should not be a matter of controversy, then, that we should all be able to acknowledge that reality. Feminism, as originally constituted, is a failure, just as affirmative action is a failure. Neither one did any of the things it was supposed to do, that its proponents promised it would do. So why do we act as if these things are just permanent features of our political landscape? When you try a thing for 50 years and it doesn't work, isn't the rational response to stop doing the thing? And we can put China policy under that same heading too. In that case, it's been 30 years. We tried. It didn't work. But do we hear anybody saying that? In either party? Bueller? I can't help wondering how many different versions they shot of that scene outside the bar. I feel like no matter what those young men did, she would have found a reason to hulk out and just kick the shit out of them. Let's say they pass by in silence. Nobody makes eye contact. And then it would be, what? Am I not pretty enough to hit on? Or suppose they come up and say, miss, do you need some help? You look a bit disheveled. And then it would be, what? Because I'm too old and dumpy to be standing outside a bar hoping to get sexually propositioned? Assholes. Or they could take the last option and say, pardon me, miss. You are so freaking hot. My friends and I would just love to have hot, sloppy group sex with you right now. But having said that, we can also tell that you are a woman of deep intellect and true passion. You're probably smarter than all of us put together, and you have spent your whole life smashing that patriarchy, putting up with all those mansplaining bastards. And ma'am, on behalf of my friends and me, it would be a real honor if we could line up and have you kick us real fucking hard right in the testicles. I think it's the least we could do. Hell, who knows? Maybe that's the last episode in the thing and I just ruined it for everybody. Thank you all very much for watching. See you Wednesday. Have a pleasant tomorrow. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.